Warning, the following video has flashing lights and also includes content that may be deemed inappropriate for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Who dares awaken me from my slumber? William Scott White, yes, an official scientist of the Midnight Society, has once again decided it is time to awaken LordeStarfox, as apparently we must get ready to go Dogman hunting. Absolutely delicious. I do appreciate you, Mr. White, bringing me something to indulge myself on and feast. Now that you have released me from my silver chains and shackles, let's get ready to take a walk into the madness.
My creatures of the night. Once again, it is midnight lycanthropy time here on LordeStarfox Radio. We do have one of the residential scientists of the Midnight Society already waiting around the late night fire, getting ready to once again burn the midnight timber into the early hours of the morning with us. Of course, I am referring to William White. Tonight, we are once again diving back into the nefarious and infamous case of the Beast of Gévaudan. There is some potentially new information floating around that could solidify once again what this thing could actually be. And in just a second, we are getting ready to take a walk in the madness. Are you ready, William?
I'm ready.
All right, my friend. Well, let me toss you the mic real quick here so that way you can give us a quick little summary as to what the Beast of Gévaudan was, and then I can stir the pot with some of the potential new information and see your thoughts on that.
Sure. So in the 18th century, 1700s, middle of the 1700s in France, there was a string of attacks on animals and people by an unknown beast. And a lot of these attacks resulted in fatalities. There were a few, survivors, but yeah, it was quite the deal. And eventually, the local marquis, kind of the lord or ruler of that area of France, he got enough complaints and he organized a hunt and put a bounty out on the beast, and it was finally brought down. And now the interesting thing about this versus a lot of other cryptid attacks is that there was a body. It was even taxidermied. It was studied by a surgeon. And so it's not just like people saw it, they saw the results of its attacks, but then it disappeared. There's concrete evidence for this thing. So it differs substantially from, most or virtually all of the Dogman accounts we hear, or the Bigfoot accounts, or anything else. Catholic churches are full of relics and important parts of local history, and so it is still on display. I don't know if they consider it a holy relic or not, but it is very much important to their culture and local history. When the beast was taxidermied, it even though, I mean, they knew how to taxidermy things. Think about like some mansion, chateau, castle from that time period, stuff full of animals, boar and elk and deer and exotic animals that the Lord hunted or that were given to him. So they knew how to preserve these animals, but even after it was taxidermied, it gave off such a horrible smell that only got worse in the heat. That eventually the remains were just buried. They didn't keep it any longer. So that's kind of interesting to me. That and apparently it started to decompose very rapidly too. The surgeon got to it to inspect it, I think 12 days after it had been, and the remains were significantly decomposed by that point. Now, this was in June. France, I'm sure, is in the middle, or at least the start of summer by June, and so heat, and it increases the decomposition of things. Nonetheless, I mean, I've got experience with animals, and yeah, after a couple weeks, they're not pleasant to be around, but they're not so significantly decomposed that it makes identifying them difficult. And the surgeon did say that it was consistent with a large wolf or a wolf dogs, but he couldn't be certain due to basically how poorly decomposed the remains were by that point. Once again, this differs significantly from almost any modern account, because not only were there witnesses, not only did hundreds, if not thousands, of people flock to see the body of the beast, but we have a documented surgery or autopsy report, basically, from this doctor who so it's like quite possibly the most well documented cryptid, if you will, if you want to call it a cryptid, sighting and experience that I can think of. And the fact that it happened 260 years ago, 70 years ago, is irrelevant, because I mean, we're talking about France. This is not some backwater. This is basically one of the heights of learning and culture in the world, especially for that time period. I think it's very interesting and worth digging into a little bit more.
Yeah, some gnarly stuff right there for sure. Some of the questions I would like to ask to you is, well, I've never been around a hyena or a natural predator, meaning, sure, even if you are raising like wolf hybrids and such, you're still doing some sort of cleanliness on them. I've heard numerous stories about the breath of crocodiles and also bears just reeking of absolute terribleness. Yet, again, though, as a predator, it probably isn't quite beneficial to be stinky, meaning that's going to cause an alert, something that you're coming. Quick little funny story about that is the Romans said when the Germanic people were coming to battle with them, that because they didn't look at cleanliness as the Romans did, that all you could smell was dirty arms and butt cheeks for like miles before you even, heard them coming.
Basically, what you eat affects your body odor and can make you very distinct smelling from other people's, absolutely. And so also cleanliness in the case of the barbarians, that the Romans were fighting.
Do you think then, as a predator, you're probably going to be aware of that? Dogs have a really good sense of smell. And I'm going to give a humorous but a really good example. There have been tests where there are the smells of farts and things, and also dogs themselves farting, and they get up and move away from the smell. Okay. They are very much aware of senses.
Absolutely. Yeah, their noses are like, I think hundreds of times more sensitive than ours. And, in the case of like bloodhounds, maybe 1,000 times more sensitive than ours. I mean, they're crazy sensitive. As far as like animal smells, bears are known to have a very distinct musky odor that I actually, I've come across a black bear a couple times in the woods, but I've never noticed an odor. But apparently people who spend time hunting them or spend time in bear country come to recognize the smell very well and use it as a warning. So I mean, animals, some animals do have very strong smells that even our human noses can pick up from a bit of a distance. And bears are predators, So I don't. As far as like their breath, any animal that's a carnivore is gonna their mouth is gonna smell like rotten meat, in part because they have they're eating meat and pieces of it get stuck between their teeth, and then it starts to decompose and puts off that rotten odor. But as far as like people saying Bigfoot has this very terrible, distinct, skunky, rotten garbage odor, yeah, that's kind of weird to me. It's like, you know, you would think that like deer and anything that the Bigfoot were predating on would smell that a mile away and be running, but I don't know.
That's what I wanted to ask is a predator, do you think, must be aware of that? That bear has to know if it can smell elks miles away. I mean, I'm used to my scent. All right. When I go and exercise, I'm like, yo, dude, I got to shower. I stink.
That's true. Yeah. You can
Okay.
pick up your
Right.
own scent. As long as now, I've spent a couple weeks without taking a shower before when I've been on long, backpacking, hiking trips. Right. And after a while, you don't smell yourself. But yeah, in our case, where generally people bathe once a day or so. Yeah, you start to notice when you are less than acceptable.
Yeah, a little ripe, and okay, so then that must probably fall into play then with an animal. They must more or less, I guess, just get accumulated to that sense. It just doesn't seem like a good hunting tactic for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, obviously every animal has its smells. Every animal is going to be putting off farts or flatulence.
Yep.
They've got their breath, even their fur. If you've ever had a dog, dog fur takes on a certain smell.
Yep.
And of course, if our noses are picking that up, then an animal's nose is going to pick that up, much
Right.
further away than ours. So, I think a big part of their hunting tactics, any predator, is staying downwind of the prey. You want to be taking in the prey's smell and not having the prey take on your smell, right? So I think that plays a big part into their hunting instinct and tactics.
Makes total sense. That would lead me into the end of that first question of, well, if it smelled so bad, I mean, again, I'm not around wild animals all the time, but I have unfortunately had the experience of being around wild boars, and those things smell absolutely disgusting.
And they're also predators. They'll eat anything. They'll eat vegetation.
Yes.
They'll eat, birds they find on the ground, small rodents, whatever they can get their mouths on. Yep.
Is it too far-fetched to think then maybe it wasn't even the actual degrading part of the meat? Yeah, sure, any meat you leave out in the sunlight's not going to smell that good, but if the animal doesn't smell good from the get-go, isn't that going to amplify it?
Yeah, quite possibly. Now, I'm not a taxidermist, and I've never really looked into it. I imagine with modern taxidermy, they wash the fur, because basically that's all that's left, right? I'm not sure what they did, if they did it exactly like that 270 years ago, but it's probably something similar. Now, the fact that they taxidermied this thing, 2 weeks after it was, they play into that. I've never, that'd be like going and scraping up ear off the side of the road and then taxiderming it. I'm not sure how successful you'd be.
Again, makes logical sense, and unfortunately this is so long ago that who knows truly if some things might have been embellished a little bit, meaning maybe they said it was out longer than it actually was, or vice versa, because long story short is, even when you cover real 100% authentic cases that are in the Guinness Book of Records and such, there's still other brilliant people out there that think some of the numbers, for example, are amplified.
Yeah, who knows? That is a weird story for sure. Apparently, the man who had the taxidermied the beast, right? This Dr. Gilbert, he was so inconvenienced by the smell that he was sick and bedridden for more than 15 days in Paris. The smell made him sick. Then he suffered from this disease for more than 6 years, and he even attributed to this bad smell that he breathed for so long the poor health that he had suffered for 6 years. And he apparently was, burdened with health problems for the rest of his life that he believes were caused by the bad odor coming off of this creature. That is something, because I've been around some pretty nasty smells. One of my first businesses was a janitorial company, and I remember a store I was contracted to clean out the freezers after there had been a fire, and the freezers sat without power for I think more than a month, and when I opened up those freezers, honestly, I've smelled a lot of bad things. That is the only time I've just had to like come out of a place gagging, almost throwing up. I had to like regather my mental fortitude to go back in there. Just this, rotten chicken and ice cream and everything else you can imagine that's in a store's freezers.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't get sick from it, and I certainly didn't have lasting health problems for years afterwards. So that's an interesting little tidbit from this story.
If this person was tanning hides for a living, man, there's a high probability whatever chemicals they were using and his type of work was the cause of what occurred to him, in my eyes.
Who knows? So I don't know how they were doing it back then.
Some of the culprits here that people like to point the finger at, I'm going to start with the most generalized ones, the wolf, or supposedly this younger man that wore some sort of wolf skin around himself, or a hyena. The newer theory coming out is, could it have been a lion potentially? And then you have the aspect of, was this just some deranged human being that more or less, well, we don't need to dive into detail, but anyone can see some of the true real life crime that has happened with psychotic people. Those
Sure.
are more or less the options here as to what could be occurring. Well, I don't know when exactly wolves were fully eradicated from Europe in certain areas, so I do not know if these villagers would have understood what a wolf looked like. If wolves were still kicking around, they're very much well aware of what a wolf looks like. But now, when you're talking about hyenas and lions, all right, a lot of people would be like, well, wait a second, how would they even have got there?
Apparently, wolves were eradicated from France in the 1930s, and the last known wolf on human attack was in 1918 in France. So,
Okay.
yeah, these folks probably were familiar with wolves.
All right, then. So we're going to put that culprit off to the side for now. When we look at hyenas and lions, a lot of people would be like, well, wait a second, that's something out of Africa. Again, if royalty wanted these pets and things, which they did, everyone can look up into that. It's kind of a sign of stature. All right. Most people would not have any idea what a hyena or a lion would look like. Yet, let's pause for a second. There's also two other potential scenarios. Recently, in the Middle East, in a lava tube, the Smithsonian found a chamber by mistake that they actually burrowed too deep into that had hundreds of thousands of human and animal bones that had been pulled in here and had the signs and activities and predation styles of like what spotted hyenas would be doing, because spotted hyenas are the only known hyenas that are in packs. All right. That tells us, are or were there hyenas in this area at this point in time? Are they using cave systems, maybe potentially coming from Africa up into the Middle East? Or now with the lions, again, there was, I don't know the exact subspecies, but it was a darker, bigger lion that had a really dark brown kind of mane, and it was in the Middle East as well. Someone did a video on it. I can't remember the supposed last picture taken of this, but you see the style lion more or less walking through the canyons, and it was believed to be the last of its kind.
I know
And
what
it's a
you're
black
talking
and
about.
yeah, it's an old school black and white photo.
Mhm.
This again could have been in France at this point in time. The final thought would be the whole psychotic person. And then you have obviously the werewolf aspect. Where do you think most likely this would fall into? And what do you think about some of the things I just brought up?
Well, the common people probably wouldn't know what a hyena looks like, but the local lord probably would. The the aristocracy would, because like you said, it was not uncommon for nobility and wealthy people to have their own menagerie with exotic animals, so they'd probably visited or read about those things. Certainly lions were known and recognized by virtually everyone. I mean, for more than 1,000 years, different noble houses would have lions on their banners and their heraldry and whatnot. As the serial, not a bad one. You could imagine some crazy guy wearing a wolf skin or a bear skin or something like that, committing these crimes. That's a possibility. Absolutely. Now it is interesting that the attacks did stop after they shot this creature. I'm doubtful that it was mistaken identity as far as like a hyena or a lion. Even if the lion was a dark color, it would still be recognized as a lion. So,
all right. So we're going to push those two off to the side. Before we dive back into this real quick, correct me if I'm wrong. I do believe the person that was responsible for hunting this pointed at a picture of a spotted hyena and said it was that, because he was shown a striped hyena and a spotted hyena. But again, what if he was the one responsible, correct?
Who knows? Yeah.
He would point, obviously, at that to more or less put an end to it. But now back to the two culprits, then. Either somebody that had the capability to shapeshift and such, or just a straight up psycho human being. The problem with the whole shapeshifting aspect is, again, I could be incorrect. That seems like you would be better off if you had some sort of stature, meaning like if you were a witch doctor or if you were an alchemist for a royal member or something with access to a lot of the things that go into supposedly shapeshifting. This dude was just a peasant out in the forest. How would he have gotten access? I mean, no one's ever going to know the truth unless they're really diving into that. But there's more than going on than just the pelt of the wolf. So let's say that's the easiest aspect to get. But what about all the other things? How would that dude have been able to do that? Do you think he's a scapegoat, or
if we're going with a shapeshifter, I mean, you could say, well, maybe he was part of some cult that had preserved these rites and rituals, and he learned it from someone else. Kind of the way the Navajo skinwalkers apparently do their thing. I mean, yeah, the interesting thing is that the European lore for how a werewolf is made is very similar to the Navajo lore. Basically they have to do horrible things. They wear the pelt of an animal. I don't know much more beyond that, but apparently those are kind of the key ingredients to the ceremony. Fairly similar in the European lore for how a werewolf is created. So I don't think the fact that he's a peasant makes that any less likely if he was connected to, like I said, some cult, some ancient, druidic rite or whatever, form of witchcraft. If we're, entertaining that thought.
It's great stuff right there. Now that makes sense. It was just something potentially that had popped into my head real quick. So I figured I'd put that out there. Well, were we thinking on this, man? I mean, what are you thinking? Is it going to just be a messed up individual, right? It's part of human existence, unfortunately, whether you're talking about Jack the Ripper or modern day times. Unfortunately, it's something that occurs.
It's really interesting because the behavior is not very animal like, right? Animals yeah, sure, there's animal on human predation. It happens every year, multiple times a year. But this string of attacks, and then it was also going after cattle and sheep and stuff like that. So it had access to farm animals. So why was it attacking people? And animals typically seem to understand that you know, making people your prey eventually gets the target on your back. It's just a very odd behavior for an animal. And it is, kind of more of the behavior of some psychopath. I honestly, I'm flummoxed. I'm kind of at a loss as to the real culprit there. I mean, they did shoot this thing. the attacks did stop, but the behavior is, whether it's a hyena or a lion or a wolf, it doesn't fit the behavior of any of
Mhm.
those. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Personally, as I've spent more time talking to you and diving into this, you actually had mentioned before where you saw a person dressed up more or less as a mountain man with animal skins on. Dude, if some crazy
Mhm.
person that's not in the right frame of mind is dressed up like that, and you just
Sure.
have someone out picking berries or food later on for the night, and this individual first appears, yeah, it's gonna scare the Christmas trees out of somebody. So from a distance, right now, if you hear screaming and you start to run over and then you see this thing run off, well, now you're like, wait a second, holy crap, that was like a 6 to 7 foot tall wolf thing that was running away. Yeah,
Yeah.
when you look at the actual behaviorisms of the victims, unfortunately, it does tend to be more human based. And recently I talked to some people about how there's some evidence supporting in certain areas that nefarious people are well aware of cryptid lore and such and actually play into that with
Oh
their
yeah.
victims, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, even not even like evil people, people intending harm. Like Arkansas in the mountains there, they love the legend of the Arkansas Howler, and they'll
Hmm.
go out in the woods and they'll make wild animal calls, and they'll talk up the legends when they're in town and stuff like that, because they want people to not go traipsing around or whatever they're doing that's illegal. They want people to kind of be afraid of the woods and those areas to keep them out of their business. Yeah, absolutely. People definitely take advantage of myths and legends. I mean, I'm not saying the Arkansas Howler isn't
Hmm.
real, but they're out there, happy as can be that legend exists.
So bizarre. Well, my final question for you would be, do you think back then these royal members would have cared about not putting information out like that to more or
Mm,
less scare people? It seemed that the villagers were already quite aware of this.
mhm.
Is it something that you think maybe the royalty just put out there that?
That's a good question because, how's it go? There's some saying that, essentially the past is a mirror to the present, the present's a mirror to
Hmm.
the past. Um, and certainly our current across the world seem to like to hold things back from us. Probably reasonable to say that it's been going for a long time, and it was
Hmm.
probably easier to do in a age without mass communication, without the internet, where printed materials were expensive, and today everyone has a cell phone and a computer. Back then, there might have been one or two printing presses in your town if you were lucky. Yeah, that's a good point. That could very well be. Maybe something else was going on, and it's a 17th, 18th century cover up.
So creepy. It just, like I said, made me think for a second, more or less, meaning let's just roll with it being a psychotic person, or let's roll with it being maybe an actual shapeshifter. Wouldn't it make more sense to tell your public it was a
Yeah,
hyena?
yeah, yeah. Tell them it was some beast, some hyena, some wolf dog thing. And cover up the fact that there was actually a psychopath out in the roaming the fields and the forests because he's crazy. Yeah, that's an
Right?
interesting idea.
Lesser of two evils, correct?
Yep.
So gnarly right
Yeah, I
there.
mean, shoot, let's create a story here. Let's suppose that it was actually some, you know, important person in society, whether he's a nobleman or a wealthy businessman. He gets his kicks off by doing these, and rather than publicize that, they blame it on an animal, and maybe they quietly took care of him, but they didn't make a big deal of it because they didn't want the people to know that there are actually people in power who are total psychopaths. I don't know.
Legendary stuff right there. Pretty much my final thoughts would be that reminds me a lot of Jack the Ripper. There's a ton of evidence supporting that he was either highly up in some sort of medical field or
Hmm.
with royalty himself, which would explain why he wasn't caught because he actually was never even in those areas, the slums, except to do like what he was doing. So yeah, pretty
Right.
gnarly stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that could very well be. It's not like corruption just started today. That's nothing. There's nothing new under the sun. I'm sure there were incredibly corrupt and messed up, twisted people, 200, 300, 1,000 years ago, no doubt. So
Preach on that, my guy, right there. Creepy stuff. Well, before we let you get back to things you need to attend to, is there anything else you would like to touch base on tonight before you get rolling?
Oh, I don't know. I think this has been a pretty good conversation. Yeah, I don't really have much else to go on, so I think we can put a pin in it right there.
Legendary stuff as always. Well, to the audience, no worries. Mr. White will be back sooner than later. He is a bi-weekly host. All you have to do is go down to the good old playlist, check out the Midnight Society Science Team or Star Fox and William White and get caught up on some of the very interesting topics we do cover. If you would like to hear potentially part one, which is not even really a part one of the Beast of Gévaudan, we just touch on some different aspects. Check out the playlist with Mr. White down below. Thanks for hanging out tonight, man. I do appreciate you.
Oh, you're always welcome. It's good to be back.
Ooh, my creatures of the night, I do adore every single one of you, and thank you for hanging out tonight. Please like, comment, subscribe, share the truth to the algorithm, and remember, there are things way worse than myself that stalk the night.